Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Turn the Page. I'm Jenn, your host today, and I'm here with the author of a really beautiful and exciting and thought-provoking new urban fantasy. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Thanks for having me. My name is Jes Battis, and I'm the author of the urban fantasy / mystery novel, The Winter Night. So the premise of The Winter Night is that in this world, the knights and characters of Arthurian mythology have been reincarnated and are living and kind of fighting with each other in Vancouver, British Columbia. There's also a group of kind of cranky Valkyrie administrators who have to deal with all the sort of dramas and blood feuds between these knights. And sometimes these feuds do turn deadly in sinister ways. When one of the high-profile knights is murdered at a kind of fancy academic party, the Valkyrie investigator named Hildy has to take on this case, and this also connects her with the character Wayne, who is the reincarnation of Gawain from a lot of different Arthurian stories. So they get drawn deeper into this mystery. Eventually, it takes them all the way up to the Sisters of Fate, who control destiny, because there is a rogue character who is trying to rewrite all of the different myths. And that's basically the climax that the book leads to.
Ooh, it was such a delight to read. I had so much fun with this book, and just thank you for writing it. Before we go into depth on the book itself, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about perhaps your career and your journey toward this book, because you've written a lot of other stuff, and you also are a medievalist and work on literature. So could you talk a little bit about how those interests and things led you to this book?
This is a good question, because I was literally just talking to my mom about this on the phone the other day, and she was asking about why the book had kind of ended up in Arthurian mythology. So yes, I think I've published generally in kind of the area of urban fantasy and that kind of like crossover fantasy, often set in a kind of urban space and often set in Canada. In terms of my academic career, it's taken a lot of weird twists and turns. Like, I started out as a specialist in pop culture, connections between literature and pop culture, but I always had a love of medieval literature. And my kind of academic research as a graduate student ended up being focused on medieval adaptations. And I've taught, a number of courses on kind of intersections between fantasy and medieval literature. And students they get really pulled in by the fantasy aspect, and then they're surprised by how interesting the literature from like the global Middle Ages ends up being. While I was this book, I actually think it started, a decade ago, and it was more focused on Norse mythology, but it just was a YA novel that wasn't really going anywhere. It kept kind of composting in the back of my brain. And then when I was teaching a course on King Arthur, I started to think, wouldn't it be interesting if these myths were set in the contemporary world, because that's been done in a number of different ways, but not usually in Canada. And Vancouver is such a weird city in British Columbia. It's kind of like Los Angeles in a way. It's there's a lot of like beauty, natural beauty, but also outrageous poverty and inequality, and there's an unreal quality to it. So I thought this might actually be a good place to set a story like this, where we see kind of European myths and how they displaced kind of indigenous worldviews and more local cosmologies and stories and things, and how that's part of colonialism as well. So that's kind of the journey, I guess, that led me to taking on a book like this.
That's so interesting. And, I was particularly interested in the Vancouver setting because this might be my, American perspective on this, but on American TV and in film, you see Vancouver masquerading as a lot of other cities, and it was refreshing for me then to see something where Vancouver itself was, playing itself in a way, and it was like very evocative and very vibrant. Like I've only been there very briefly, but it like really resonated with what I remember about it. And yeah, like I'd also be curious to ask, how perhaps some of your academic writing maybe played into this book too, because you have a monograph called Thinking Queerly, Medievalism, Wizardry and Neurodiversity in YA Texts. And so much of those interests and topics seem to, have kind of made their way into this book too. Was that something that you were thinking about as you were writing?
That's a great question. As an aside, half of my family is American, and so I often have similar conversations with American relatives who will be like, "Oh yeah, we saw Vancouver again but it wasn't Vancouver. It's always something else." And that was one of the reasons I wanted to set it there as well. It's always kind of standing in for another place, and that kind of made it more unreal. In terms of the academic work, yes, that like they kind of dovetailed in a lot of interesting ways. I was working on Thinking Queerly around the time that the pandemic started. And that's also the time that the Winter Night was kind of entering the form that it would eventually be in. And so I started to feel after a while that I was pouring a lot of the scholarly work and energy into Thinking Queerly, and then trying to kind of put all the feeling and emotion into the Winter Night. And quickly realized like they were overlapping in a lot of interesting ways. And so Thinking Queerly ended up being a lot more personal than I suspected that it would be. There's a lot of kind of memoir in that book as well. And some of the academic stuff found its way into the Winter Night as well, especially with the character of Vera as this adjunct professor who is kind of struggling to keep her job even though she's an expert. And the classroom scenes were really fun for me to write because I got to sort of look at them from the perspective of a student again, as opposed to an instructor. So that was really fun.
Oh, that is really cool. Yeah, a lot of those scenes were really fun for me as, I like to say failed academic, but like it's it's kind of by choice. I'm in libraries by choice now. But
We're
yeah,
all failed academics. Like academia fails. It failed you, but everyone it didn't. We're not the failures.
that's a very good point. Thank you. Yeah, but it was really nice to like see that setting again, and to like it's a very honest portrayal too. Like you get the allure and what draws so many people to it, and like the kind of messed up parts about it. So yeah, like did you put your actual university experiences into the portrayal in this book?
A little bit. I have a previous series to this called the Parallel Park series, which is an urban fantasy. It's actually set in Regina, Saskatchewan. Like nothing is ever set in Saskatchewan. And that the portrait of that particular university is very similar to the institution that I still work at, although I changed a lot of things and made it a little bit more fantastical. In the case of the Winter Night, I would say the institution that I went to when I was in Vancouver is Simon Fraser University, and there are some connections. Both schools are on top of a mountain. They're kind of remote in that way. There's a sense that I was trying to convey the kind of brutal inequalities in academia that 80 to 90% of instructors teach on contract, including characters like Vera, who like, how could you be more qualified to teach Arthurian literature when you're actually a character? And that was part of that joke as well, even though like the situation is fairly serious. Academia is really melting down. But I wanted to kind of convey that in a darkly funny way, and I hope that landed.
Absolutely. It was like therapeutic to read, and I'm sure it was partially so to write as well. I have a comic that is also set at a university, and it was like, yeah, like worked a lot of stuff out.
What comic is that?
It's called An Embarrassment of Witches. It came out March 3rd, 2020, which was fantastic timing, but
Great.
yeah. Yeah, I really love, yes, the portrayal of academic life and the social life around universities and how that all plays into the urban fantasy setting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about our two main characters, Hildy and Wayne, because they're so rich, and they have such really fascinating inner lives, and they just felt so real and dynamic to me. Could you, talk a little bit about how you shaped these characters and perhaps like their relationships?
That's a good question. I really struggled with Hildy's character because at first I was basing her on a lot of kind of urban fantasy detectives that I had read in the kind of feminist urban fantasy that came out in the 80s and 90s by writers like Mercedes Lackey and Tanya Huff, like women in leather jackets who were witches, but they were also sensitive. Like I was trying to kind of get at that in some way, and it wasn't really working. And it really helped working with my editors at ECW to kind of figure out what Hildy's central conflicts were as a character, and how, you know, it wasn't just that she was trying to get out of her mother's shadow. It was that she was dealing with being a queer asexual person and trying to figure that out, and trying to figure out how she could have a more traditional life, and if that's even what she wanted. And that really helped, I think, conversations I had back and forth with my editors to dig a little bit further into that character, so that she wasn't just a kind of neo-noir fantasy detective, that she had this other stuff going on in her life. Wayne, I think I've written variations on that character before, like someone who is younger and neurodivergent in some way and struggling with it. But I wanted to do it a lot more explicitly this time, and have a character who's sort of college age, on the borderline of being diagnosed autistic, but like can't get the supports that he needs, because that was very similar to my experience in college. And it was a tricky process shaping that character, because I wanted him to be different from me in a lot of ways, but a lot of my own life was informing that as well. I think in the end, he's like, he's a bit more daring than I was in college, a little bit more extroverted. And there are some other differences between us, but I always had to kind of keep checking back and being like, okay, make sure you're not just sort of telegraphing your own college experience with this character. So I hope he ended up, I like how he turned out. I think he's a little bit like sassier than I was at that age as well.
Yeah, I love him so much, and I really love Hildy too. And something that occurred to me while I was reading is that the sort of their rich inner lives really plays in very well with the Arthurian legend, because so many of like the knight's journeys are about achieving something in the external world, but are also about like a deep personal transformation and like marking a passage of time or in the life phase, and could you talk a little bit about how myth and character development kind of play together?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the, I think a concrete example of this was in the character of Gale, who is this kind of forgotten knight from Arthurian mythology. When I was doing research for Thinking Queerly, and also when I was teaching Arthurian literature, I encountered this weird kind of ghostly character in French Arthurian traditions, which is like, this like 10-volume long prose text that nobody really reads. It's sort of like the Old Testament. Everyone says like, yeah, I've read it from cover to cover, but even medievalists haven't really read it.
Mm-hmm.
And there was this character floating around who he just seemed really clearly to be in love with Lancelot, to the point where the narrator said he died of love for Lancelot. And I thought, why isn't this character in the more traditionally known versions of the legends by Thomas Malory and writers like that? And a lot of academics pointed to this and said, Malory just didn't know what to do with all this like really sexy French stuff. So he kind of flattened it out, and everything is a little bit more didactic. But I wanted to give that character a little bit of life. Like, what would that be like to be caught in this like weird three-way relationship with Guinevere and Lancelot? You got the most famous knight in the world and the most famous queen in the world, and you're this like nobody. So I really enjoyed exploring that character. and then also taking him out of the European context and thinking, well, what if he came from Spain? Because at that time, in sort of the early Middle Ages, Spain was a Muslim country, and so there were all these super interesting Jewish and Muslim and Christian influences that were all kind of competing with each other. So I think that that's an example. That character is an example of how you can kind of take a very sort of fuzzy myth and try to kind of mine it for some of the personal growth. Like, what if this character had really been given more space? What would his desires be? What would he want to do?
Yeah, that's such an interesting perspective on myth for me, because I think especially a lot of times when we talk about myth, it's about how they were made to explain the world around us, you know, and like how things operate and stuff like that. But a lot of them are also about like how humans work, you know, like how we work on the inside. And I love like how they just play together here. You know, when you are adapting these really iconic characters to a modern setting, how do I phrase this? What is your approach to where you modernize or add your own little touch? You know, like what details do you tend to keep and what do you play with, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I like that question. If I think of a character like Hildy, so she's based in some ways on older Norse stories, but there's also some kind of fragmentary Old English material on Valkyries that's very cryptic. It's just like there were these giant spear women. And so I like the challenge of kind of starting with very little information and then trying to embroider it a bit, trying to imagine, well, a Valkyrie's task in across various myths is to kind of choose who lives and who dies on a battlefield. So what would that be like as a kind of a cranky, stressed out detective? And as the novel kind of approaches its climax, Hildy does find herself more in that. She does literally find herself in a moment where she has to choose who lives and who dies and kind of try to figure out how she's going to be able to manage that. So I like kind of choosing some of those fuzzy details and expanding on them a bit. In the case of someone like, say, Vera as Queen Guinevere, she is often a really she's an inconsistent character in a lot of myths. Sometimes she's very regal and powerful. Sometimes she's very petty. There are some myths in which she puts people's lives in danger for no apparent reason. And I wanted to construct a character who would just be full of contradictions. So thinking, what is what's a situation in which someone who's a queen would be most annoyed? Well, if they were downgraded to adjunct professor and they had to just continually apply for their job all the time. So there are a lot of situations, I think, when I tried to find kind of details that would frustrate the mythic character, like would kind of bring them a little bit down to earth. With Gawain, he is very different across a lot of myth cycles, but what tends to be consistent is that he's always young and he always has this incredible reputation, but beneath the reputation, he's very anxious. And so I thought, okay, well, what if we make him an anxious undergrad? Because it makes sense when you start college, you're sort of like, yeah, I'm really going to rock this. And then you have your first class and you're like, that was terrible. I don't know what I'm doing. So those were kind of some ways in which I tried to take those myths, I think, and kind of bring them down to earth a bit.
I really like that. And, you know, I like the way that you use the myths too to talk about, you know, fate and cycles and being caught in them and escaping them. You know, there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on there. Another concern that I see across this book and some of your other stuff, because is found family, you know, and that is something that I am super interested in, that I just like, you know, love in my own life and I love in literature and I love just wherever I encounter it. And can you talk a little bit about, you know, yeah, how it functions in your story? Because you've also written about found family in Buffy, right? If I remember correctly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, can you talk a little bit about, yeah, found family and the role it plays like in your works and your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I often say that I wrote that book on Buffy like out of a experience of loneliness because I moved to Vancouver for grad school and I didn't know anyone in the city, was living in a terrible apartment. And it was the kind of era of the DVD set where you could sort of, go down to, the Canadian equivalent of Target and buy a set of DVDs. And so I just binge watched Buffy and felt like that the chosen family on that show was giving me something that I wasn't getting in the kind of my cohort of grad students. And I kept trying to make it like that, be like, yeah, can't we all be the Scoobies? And they're like, we're busy, we're writing papers. And I thought, yeah, okay, there's a kind of interesting disconnect there, but it has always been a theme in my work. Um, and in other series, I often focus on friends because it feels like friendships are maybe less examined in fantasy literature. There's often a kind of primary romance plot. And with The Winter Night, I wanted to really veer away from that and there's a kind of very subtle queer romance between two characters. And then there's the more obvious romance that's developing between Wayne and Bert as a character. But even that is sort of a little bit awkward. I just find that a lot of genre fantasy and literary fantasy, there's almost always a romantic core to it, and there's less exploration of the kind of depth of friendships and specifically how those function in queer communities where you're often relying on your friends for all sorts of different types of care and connection that you're maybe getting from your biological family, but also there are these other types of things that you're relying on your friends for. So I think that it's just something that I've always been interested in, and I've tried to convey it in a book like The Winter Night, especially with the friendship between Wayne and Kai, which is this kind of ride or die friendship.
Mm. Yeah, I think what appeals to me about it is that, I think as, maybe as a people, we tend to think that like either romantic or family relationships are like the strongest or the best, to put like a very weird term on it, and that friendships are somehow seen as less than, but they can be so much equally as important or more important if you don't have like stronger ties in those other areas, and so I really love seeing like how that functions on the page. Um, and it does say interesting things about fate too, because I think oftentimes romance, especially like, uh heteronormative, like monogamous romance, is very like, this is all tied up in notions of fate and being meant to be together and all the one person who's going to fulfill all your needs, and I think that friendship is often allowed to like be more about choice and like, I don't know, it can fulfill all those, same or different emotional needs, but just without, I think I kind of lost track of that thought, but do you know what I was trying to say?
Yeah, there's a moment in with The Winter Night where Hildy is talking to her friend Shar and saying like, I've lost track of all the like feminist boys and girls that I've dated who seemed really cool about friendship and taking it slow, but then within 5 seconds they were like, why aren't we sleeping together? And I I've seen that more. I think there's more YA novels that are focused on characters that are asexual, but I don't know that we're seeing it as much in kind of more. It's sometimes hard to classify Winter Night. I would say like Wayne's perspective is maybe what we call new adult, and then Hildy's is sort of adult. So I was hoping to kind of convey a slightly more non-traditional relationship. Another thing I've been thinking about over the last, like, especially over the course of the pandemic too, is how like a lot of people have been divided from their families through politics and also through kind of how they deal, like how willing they are to keep each other safe and to keep family. Like I think there've been a lot of really aggressive dividing lines that are kind of making found families even more important, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yes, that is so true. I think like in a way almost, the political divisions that have like happened in the last couple of years have actually maybe shown some people that love that was like claiming what's the word? Oh gosh, I'm totally blanking on the word for like unconditional. Yes. Love that claimed to be unconditional actually like did not survive, a lot of conditions all of a sudden happened,
Exactly.
and then like, yes, found family and your friends become very important because yeah. Yeah, I really like that. Thank you.
When I think about the kind of radical hope that we had when Obama was first elected, and I think like queer and racialized people in particular being like, okay, it's finally happening. And then the experience of seeing Trump inaugurated and everyone just being like, oh, okay, we've really, and then the sort of divisions in families where people that, my dad voted for Trump, but my mom didn't. And so now how do we have conversations? It has felt like chosen families and found families have maybe become even more, not that they weren't always significant, but they're becoming, I think, more visible.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree. Yeah, and I think it helps us also reframe our like birth families as perhaps like, not fated, but also either chosen or not chosen, so
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much for coming to the show to talk about this book. I loved it so much, and I can't wait for our listeners to read it. Could you talk a little bit about anything that you have on the horizon? Do you have anything you're currently working on, or?
Sure. I can say that I have a project that I'm working on currently, a novel, and it focuses on a supernatural department store. It's like an occult department store in a small town that's trying to unionize, and that's essentially the focus of that project. And on the back burner, in the very back of my mind, I have a kind of epic fantasy novel involving a wizard murder mystery. I don't know when that's going to get written, but those are the kind of two projects that I've been cycling back and forth on.
That's so cool. Well, I hope you'll come back and, consider discussing those works when you have gotten to them, because I've enjoyed talking to you today and I can't wait to see what you do next.
It's been such a pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me, and I'm really happy to come back on as well and talk about future works.
Thank you. Okay, listeners, please pick up The Winter Night at your favorite bookstore or library. It will be available at the time that you hear this. And yes, it does have an absolutely beautiful cover. It is amazing. Thank you so much for listening. It is time to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.